This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there.
From Innistrad to Shadowmoor, what spooky top 10 does Nitzahone have in store?
Hi everyone, I'm Nitzahone, and welcome to another spooky MTG Top 10. Every Friday this month I'm putting out a Halloween-inspired MTG Top 10, and this Friday we're taking a look at one of Magic's spookiest creature types, vampires. Vampires have been around since Magic's beginning, and the game's very first vampire, Sengir Vampire, is probably still the most iconic. I've actually looked at vampires in two previous October MTG Top 10s, but I last looked at them in 2019. We've gotten a whole lot more vampires since then, between return visits to two of Magic's most vampiric planes, Innistrad and Ixalan. In fact, in terms of topics I've revisited, this one is tied for the most turnover with the Simic video I did a couple years back. Only 3 cards that were on the list in 2019 are still on the list today. In all, there are 430 cards in Magic that have the vampire creature type or create vampire creature tokens, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. I use a scoring system where cards are awarded 2 points for first-tier top 8s like Pro Tours, and 1 point for second-tier top 8s like Regional Championships. Before we look at the list proper, let's take a look at the 7 vampires that made the 2019 list, but didn't make it this time, starting with Insolent Neonate, which was at number 10 last time. For 1 red mana, it's a 1/1 with Menace, and you can discard a card and sacrifice the Neonate to draw a card. Dropping the Neonate on turn 1 usually means it'll chip in for some damage, and once it's lived out its usefulness as an attacker, you can throw it away to try and find something else. Having to discard a card as well as sacrifice the Neonate isn't always great, but there are enough decks out there that can generate value from discarding for the Neonate to have a pretty respectable showing in multiple formats over the years. For example, it saw play in graveyard-oriented aggro decks in Standard alongside creatures that liked being in the graveyard, like Prized Amalgam, as well as Madness cards like Fiery Temper, which you can cast for a discount if you discard it. For its other top 8s, the Neonate almost always saw play alongside the Dredge mechanic, because you can discard a card with Dredge when you pay for the cost, and then immediately mill a bunch of cards with Dredge, instead of drawing a card. While the Neonate hasn't been entirely inactive over the last 5 years, it's gained 4 points, 20 points was nowhere near enough to make the list this time, as the number 10 card has 44 points. Between being so far behind and not having any top 8s in 2024, Insolent Neonate has no real chance of ever becoming one of Magic's top 10 vampires ever again. Next, there's Vampire Hexmage, which was at number 9 last time. For 2 black mana, it's a 2/1 with First Strike, and you can sacrifice it to remove all counters from target permanent. While the Hexmage was definitely printed as a card to hate on decks that are reliant on counters, it also unlocked an incredibly strong combo that has been viable in multiple formats. When combined with Dark Depths, a land that enters with 20 ice counters and gives you a 20/20 indestructible flyer when the last counter is removed, you could use the Hexmage to get that huge token in the extreme early game. Decks using this combo were first successful in Extended, so much so that when Modern was created as the format that replaced Extended, Dark Depths got banned, and it's still banned in Modern today. Legacy is where Dark Depths decks have thrived the most, and the recent introduction of Battles, and especially Invasion of Ikoria, has breathed new life into the Hexmage, giving you a new combo that puts a huge creature into play early. While an 8/8 isn't nearly as scary as Merit Lage, the battle side of Invasion of Ikoria can actually tutor up the Hexmage, making it into a 1-card combo. Decks looking to do this have found a bit of success in Modern too. The Hexmage has actually been pretty active over the last 5 years, amassing 22 points, but it fell short of staying on the list by a few points. The good news is that if the Hexmage continues to see heavy play in Legacy, it has a good shot at reclaiming a spot on this list in the future. Next, there's Vampire Nighthawk, which was at number 8 last time. For 1 generic and 2 black, it's a 2/3 with Flying, Lifelink, and Death Touch. Probably one of the most famous French vanilla creatures ever, the Nighthawk's slew of keyword abilities make it into a threatening flyer that can quickly put a race out of reach thanks to Lifelink, and Death Touch means it can trade for absolutely anything. Its points all came in standard and extended mid-range decks, but it hasn't put up a top 8 in 11 years, so it's no surprise it lost its spot on the list. Next, there's Adanto Vanguard, which is at number 7 last time. Most of Magic's vampires are either black or red, but Ixalan introduced us to mono-white vampires like the Vanguard. For 1 generic and a white, it's a 1/1 that gets +2/+0 when it attacks, and you can pay 4 life to give it indestructible until end of turn. This makes the Vanguard a super efficient attacker that usually can't die in combat, and it doesn't die to most removal either. Even the threat of activation is enough so you don't end up actually having to pay the life all that often. Unsurprisingly, its top 8s have all come in aggro decks in both Standard and Pioneer. In Standard, it largely appeared in straightforward White Weenie decks, and in Pioneer, it's usually played in Aura and Heroic decks. Both of these kinds of decks specialize in targeting your creature and buffing them. One of the risks of doing such a thing is that your opponent can kill your creature in response, but that's a lot less true about the Vanguard thanks to its indestructibility. It's still seeing play in Pioneer right now, and has put up 16 points in the last 5 years, so like Vampire Hexmage, it has a chance at finding its way back on the list in the future. Next, it's Falcon Wrath Aristocrat, which was at number 6 last time. For 2 generic, a black, and a red, it's a 4/1 with Flying and Haste, and you can sacrifice a creature to make it indestructible until end of turn, and if the creature you sacrificed was a human, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Aristocrat. A 4-mana 4/1 with Flying and Haste is a pretty sweet aggro creature to begin with. It can do lethal in a hurry. And while having 1 toughness is a very real downside, the Aristocrat's ability to become indestructible minimizes that problem, and sometimes it can even grow and represent an even quicker clock. On top of all of that, the Aristocrat also has a free sacrifice ability, something that always has tons of potential. While it was played in straightforward aggro decks in Standard, it was also played in an Aristocrats deck that was the best at leveraging the sacrifice ability for value. This was best accomplished with Blood Artist, which drains life whenever a creature dies. When you pair the Aristocrat with creatures that leave extra bodies behind like Doomed Traveler and Zathrid Necromancer, this can allow you to do lethal out of nowhere between the +1/+1 counters and the life drain. That said, the Aristocrat hasn't seen any play since rotating out of Standard, and that's why it lost its spot on the list. Next, there's Viscera, which was at number 5 last time. For 1 black mana, it's a 1/1, and you can sacrifice a creature to scry 1. So like the Aristocrat, this has a free sacrifice ability, and in this case you can have it come down on turn 1. That has allowed the Seer to excel, especially in combo decks since you can get it down so early. Almost all of its points have come in Modern, where it's been a fixture in toolbox decks since the format was created. These are decks that run lots of singleton creatures that are good in a particular situation. Over the years they've been tutored up with Birthing Pod or Court of Calling. But in addition to being able to find hate pieces, these decks are also excellent at assembling creature-based combos with their tutors. In the case of Viscera, it's been useful alongside Melira and Persist creatures. If you have Melira and a creature with Persist in play, you can just sacrifice the Persist creature to the Seer as many times as you want. This is because Melira doesn't let that creature ever gain a -1/-1 counter, so it just keeps persisting. More recently, it's been used alongside Samwise Gamgee and Cauldron Familiar. As long as you have a food in play, you can sacrifice the Familiar to the Seer, then sacrifice a food to the Familiar to bring it back from the graveyard, which causes Samwise to make a food token, and you rinse and repeat from there. This is another vampire that hasn't been entirely inactive over the last 5 years, and its combo potential makes it hard to count it out entirely, so it's another candidate that may be back on the list someday. The last card to make the 2019 list but miss out this time is Blood Baron of Viscopa, which was at number 3 last time. For 3 generic, a white, and a black, it's a 4/4 with lifelink and protection from white and black. And if you have 30 or more life and your opponent has 10 or less life, it gets +6/+6 and flying. Obviously, the Baron is a nightmare if you're playing black or white, since it will quickly allow your opponent to gain life and pressure you at the same time, and once you're down to 10, it's pretty likely you're dead because the Baron can kill you in one swing. In both Block and Standard, the Blood Baron had protection from some of the format's most powerful removal spells, and it was the win condition for many control decks. More recently, he's benefited from the creation of the Pioneer format, which was brand new back in 2019 when I made the list. There, he tends to see play in Niv Mizzet Reborn sideboards. When you're up against an opponent relying on black and white, it's nice to sight it in and be able to hit it with Niv's Enter the Battlefield ability. Like many other cards that lost a spot on the list this time, it does have a chance at making the top 10 again someday. In the case of the Blood Baron, it only missed by 2 points, but for now, it's not quite one of Magic's top 10 vampires. However, our next card is, because it's at number 10, and that card is Vein Ripper. A newcomer to the list and the newest card on it, Vein Ripper has quickly become a powerful card in multiple formats. For 3 generic and 3 black, it's a 6/5 with flying and ward, sacrifice a creature. That ward means your opponent has to sacrifice a creature when they target the Ripper, otherwise the spell or ability gets countered. In other words, that means your opponent has to 2-for-1 themselves to take it down, and things get even sillier from there, because whenever a creature dies, target opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. Importantly, it's when any creature dies. So even if your opponent immediately kills the Ripper, they get 2-for-1 and lose 4 life while you gain 4 life because both the Ripper and the creature they sacrificed have died. And if left unchecked, the Ripper quickly closes out the game. It hasn't done a ton in Standard, where it occasionally shows up in ramp decks, but the same can't be said for Pioneer, where when combined with Sorin Imperious Bloodlord, the Ripper is completely ridiculous. This is because Sorin has a -3 that lets you put a vampire from your hand directly on the battlefield on turn 3, and Sorin doesn't even die, so it can stick around and buff the Ripper, and like I already said, even the fail case for Vein Ripper is advantageous for its controller, so getting it down that early is insane. So insane that Sorin got banned from Pioneer in August. The Vein Ripper Sorin combo is still intact in Modern, but the deck it was being played in that format was reliant on Grief, a card that is also now banned out of Modern. And since that ban, Vein Ripper hasn't seen play in the format. In other words, while Vein Ripper was a multi-format powerhouse for a minute there, the decks he was part of in both Pioneer and Modern have been banned into oblivion, and it currently doesn't really have a home in Standard. So while it's on the list right now, it doesn't look great for its future presence on it, especially since so many of the cards that lost a spot on the list are still active and not that far behind Vein Ripper. At number 9, it's Voldaren Epicure, which wasn't on the list in 2019 because it didn't even exist. For 1 red mana, it's a 1/1, and when it enters, it does 1 to each opponent and you create a blood token. This might seem kind of underwhelming at first, but you're getting a ton for only 1 mana. A body, a ping, and a blood token, which is a very useful piece of material to have. You can use that blood just to rummage, something that's pretty useful when you're a red deck that needs to stop drawing lands, but there are various other things you can do with a random artifact. In a lot of ways, he's like a red Thraben Inspector, and that's an amazing 1-drop, and so is this. In Standard and Pioneer, it has seen lots of play in traditional red aggro decks, but also in decks that could leverage the fact that you get 2 permanents out of 1 card with the Epicure. For example, in Boros Convoke decks in both formats, you can get extra value out of the blood token by destroying it with Gleeful Demolition or tapping it with Warden of the Inner Sky, and in Modern and Pauper, you can add Kuldotha Rebirth to the list of powerful ways to turn that 1 blood token into lots of value. While Voldaren Epicure is no longer in Standard, it's going to continue to rack up points in Pioneer, Modern, and Pauper, and it's going to claim the number 8 spot on this list in the very near future, but for now, that spot belongs to Olivia Voldaren, which has dropped 6 spots since 2019. For 2 generic, a black, and a red, she's a 3/3 flyer, and you can pay 1 generic and a red to have her do 1 damage to another target creature. That creature becomes a vampire in addition to its other types, and you put a +1/+1 counter on Olivia. That part about becoming a vampire might just sound like some silly flavor text, and while the flavor is excellent, becoming a vampire actually matters, because Olivia's other activated ability lets you pay 3 generic and 2 black to gain control of target vampire for as long as you control Olivia. Basically, she's a decent-sized flyer who can kill opposing creatures with her activated ability, especially smaller ones, and she can steal the ones that you can't outright kill. In both Standard and Modern, she used to see a lot of play in Jund mid-range decks, but she's been out of favor in Modern for a long time at this point, where her stat line and the cost of her activated abilities have both felt pretty overcosted for a while now. That's why she slipped so far down this list, and at this point, she's not going to be here much longer. At number 7, it's Silver Smoke Ghoul, another newcomer to the list that didn't even exist back in 2019. This ghoul is both a vampire and a zombie, which is extra spooky. Anyway, for 2 generic and a black, it's a 3/1. At the beginning of your instep, if you gained 3 or more life in your turn, you return the ghoul from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. You can also pay 1 generic and a black and sacrifice it to draw a card. Creatures that can return directly to the battlefield tend to find their way into competitive Magic decks, and this one can even give itself up to draw you a card. Things really get silly in decks where you can both gain life and self-mill a lot, because in that situation you can get this 3/1 into play without ever paying anything for it. That kind of deck is pretty specific, and as a result the Ghoul was never played in Standard, but it's done some serious work in Pioneer, Modern, and Vintage. In Pioneer, it's been played in self-mill decks, and before the ban, it was also played in decks running Sorin and Vein Ripper, since it had the vampire type, and if your opponent killed your Ripper, you would have gained enough life to bring the Ghoul back. Vintage is where it's been the most successful, and that's because in that format, there's a deck built around Bazaar of Baghdad, which is all about milling your entire library in a flash and putting a bunch of creatures into play for no mana at all on turn 1. The Bazaar combines especially well with Dredge, since it has you both discard and draw, and if you happen to mill Creeping Chill alongside Silver Smoke Ghouls, you're going to get all those ghouls back after draining so much life from your opponent. Silver Smoke Ghoul is going to continue to thrive, especially in Vintage, so it's got a pretty good chance at moving higher on the list. At number 6, it's Balustrade Spy. While it's a newcomer to the list, it isn't because it's a new card. After all, it was originally printed in 2013's Gatecrash, however it only had 6 points back then, so it's been quite active over the last 5 years. For 3 generic and a black, it's a 2/3 flyer, and when it enters, target player reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a land card, then they put those cards into their graveyard. The goal with the Spy is actually to target yourself and mill your entire library, and that's something that has become a lot easier because in 2022, with the introduction of modal double-face cards that are lands on one side and spells on the other, the Spy sees those cards as non-lands, so you can still actually have lands in your deck, but mill your entire library in one shot. And you can win the game thanks to that by milling the aforementioned Crippling Chills alongside Silver Smoke Ghouls, and when those ghouls come back, they are also joined by Narcomoeba and Prized Amalgam, and as long as you have something like World Spineworm to prevent you from milling out entirely, you're going to win on your next turn. This combo was so potent that the Spy ultimately got banned in Pioneer, but decks looking to abuse the Spy alongside creatures and effects that are free from the graveyard have continued to thrive in the Eternal formats. It's just one of the best ways to mill your whole library, so it's going to keep on gaining points. At number 5, it's Sorin Solemn Visitor. It's a newcomer to the list, but it's not because it's gained points over the last 5 years. In fact, it hasn't gained any. So why wasn't it on the list back in 2019? Well, back then, I wasn't including cards that made creature tokens with a particular type in lists that looked at that creature type. I do that these days, so I figured I should update this list to reflect that. For 2 generic, a white and a black, he's a 4 loyalty planeswalker. His -2 is what gets him on the list, because it creates a 2/2 black vampire creature token with flying. He's also got a +1 that gives your whole board +1/+0 and lifelink, and a -6 that gives you an emblem that makes your opponent sacrifice a creature every upkeep. In both Standard and Modern, Sorin was largely played in token decks. His +1 was great to use when you already have a board built out with tokens, and his -2 is good when you really need to add to the board and protect him. He hasn't been played anywhere since 2016, and it's likely to lose its spot on the list in the long run, but it has enough points that it's probably going to be a while. At number 4, it's another Sorin, Sorin the Mirthless, a newcomer to the list that didn't exist back in 2019. For 2 generic and 2 black, it's a 4 loyalty planeswalker, and as with Sorin Solemn Visitor, his -2 is what gets him on the list. It makes a 2/3 vampire token with flying and lifelink. He's also got a +1 that lets you look at your top card, and you can reveal that card and put it into your hand if you want to, and if you do, you lose life equal to its mana value. He's also got a -7 that does 13 to any target and gains you 13 life. So, if you're ahead when you play him, you're likely to draw cards, and if you're behind, you're going to make a pretty beefy token. Flying and lifelink is pretty sweet to have, as it makes that creature have a super outsized impact on a race. Sometimes just playing Sorin and -2ing 2 turns in a row is enough to win, and usually if you get to that ultimate, you're obviously going to win too. This Sorin was played in tons of mid-range and control decks in Standard, it's still seeing play in those types of decks in Pioneer, and it's even been played in Legacy some. It's going to keep on putting up points in the future, but the top 3 on this list are on a whole other level. They all have a huge lead over Sorin and are currently more active than it is too. Like our number 3 card, which is Bloodghast, which was at number 4 last time. It's the only card from that 2019 list to actually move up, and that's because it has become even more heavily played over the last few years, so it was able to keep up with all these newcomers. For 2 black mana, it's a 2/1 that can't block, and it has haste whenever your opponent has 10 or less life. If it's in your graveyard and you have a land enter the battlefield under your control, it returns directly to the battlefield. So yeah, it's sort of similar to Silver Smoke Ghoul, which we saw earlier, in that it can come back directly to the battlefield, but its requirement to return is much easier to trigger. Bloodghast only saw modest play in Standard, putting up 1 Pro Tour top 8 in a Vampire Tribal deck. Extended would be where it first saw play in the deck that has made Bloodghast such a powerhouse, Dredge. As with Silver Smoke Ghoul, you can dredge away a bunch of your library or otherwise mill yourself, and then get Bloodghast back without ever spending any mana on it. It's filled this role in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage for a long time, and that's just going to continue. At number 2, it's Blood Tithe Harvester, a newcomer to the list. For a black and a red, it's a 3/2, and when it enters, it makes a blood token. You can also tap the Harvester and sacrifice it to give a creature -X/-X until end of turn, where X is twice the number of blood tokens you control, but you can only activate it as a sorcery. We've already discussed that blood tokens are really good, and the baseline on Blood Tithe Harvester is that you get a nice aggro creature that gives you a very useful token. If you've reached a point in the game where it can no longer attack effectively, or you really need to kill a scary threat, it can just be removal too, which is amazing. So basically, it's great on turn 2, and great the entire rest of the game too. All of that power has led to the Harvester seeing very heavy play in Standard and Pioneer. In the latter, it's often played in Sacrifice decks, which can get even more value out of the Blood token, and the Harvester's ability, thanks to cards like Mayhem Devil. It also doesn't hurt that the Harvester is amazing to make copies of with Reflection of Kiki-Jiki, because Fable of the Mirror Breaker is one of the most heavily played cards in Pioneer. When you make a copy with the Reflection, you get a token that makes a blood, and you can use that ability right away. It's also been showing up in Modern, although like Vein Ripper, it has seen less play since Grief got banned, as that was a big part of many Rakdos decks in the format. Still, it's a very important card in Pioneer right now, and it's likely to keep on gaining points, and it's not impossible for it to one day be the number 1 card on the list, especially if it can find a new home in Modern. For now though, that number 1 card is Kalitas, Trader of Get, which was also at number 1 last time. For 2 generic and 2 black, it's a 3/4 with lifelink, and if a non-token creature an opponent controls would die, you instead exile that card and make a 2/2 zombie token. You can also pay 2 generic and a black and sacrifice another zombie or vampire to put 2 +1/+1 counters on him. Transforming any creature of your opponent's who dies into a zombie is some very real value, and it doesn't hurt that all of your opponent's creatures also get exiled when they go to the graveyard, helping you to disrupt graveyard shenanigans. Then he can eat his zombie friends to get even bigger, something that becomes increasingly problematic because of lifelink, since before your opponent even knows what's going on, you can end up with a huge life total. Kalitas is the kind of creature who is utterly dominant in control decks, since he makes blocking and all of your removal spells way better, giving you that zombie value anytime those things happen. Then the lifelink makes it hard for an aggro deck to do lethal to you. He was heavily played in Standard, at first mostly in control decks, but later on he was also played in zombie typal decks, since he gave you lots of zombies and could even eat them. He's also found success in several other formats like Modern and Legacy, but Pioneer is really the non-standard format where he has really left his mark, and another format where it's a fixture in control decks. He's going to keep on seeing lots of play in Pioneer, and it's going to be interesting to see whether Blood Tithe Harvester or Kalitas ends up at number 1 in the end. So, those are the top 10 vampires in Magic. Are you interested in building a vampire deck? If you are, check out the description, where you'll find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past MTG top 10s, including more that are Halloween themed or that look at specific creature types, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.